So today, just as a heads up, what we're going to talk about. Okay, we're going to talk about a little topic of mental health things that we see in kids in Sunday school. Okay, we're going to try not to get too technical about stuff, but the big question that I have, and the big question that I want to share with you, is what's our role? Like, what do we need to know at the end of the day? What's important for us to know? In terms of, we're not going to diagnose people, we're not going to treat people, we're not going to do all that kind of stuff, but we have a specific role for the people that we're serving. So that's going to be kind of our narrowed scope. I'm going to try to give you some general things about specific disorders and how our approach should be. And feel free in the middle, like ask questions, throw pizza at me, whatever you need to do. You know, I'm here for whatever it is you need. Okay, just as a quick intro, you guys may know me. Like, my name's Mina, I grew up in this church, and I'm a psychiatrist. The only reason I say that is to distinguish what does that mean. Medical doctor specializing in mental health. Speaking of medical doctors, who are the bosses of all the things. And I was part of a group that was working on a mental health center in New Jersey. It's part of the church initiative to address the issues of mental health. That's all I'll say about me. Okay. Our goals today, like I said, is what's the Orthodox understanding of these mental health concerns? What is it that we can do about it? What is it that we need to know? Okay? First, without going into too many details, is this a common thing? Just give me a hand raise if you know somebody, both in church or in your community or in school, who has dealt with some mental health issue on some level. Just give me a hand raise. Okay? You look around, it's almost everybody. So the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, tells us this is something that's happening globally too. Not just us in our community, but 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 in their lifetime may deal with a mental health issue. Okay? Nearly 1 million people, 1 million people die by suicide every year globally. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And I'm hoping for this conversation, we're not going to be morbid. I'm not going to tell you just all these terrible bad things that are going on. We're going to focus on the solution. What do we do in a positive sense? Okay? The church is not an exception. This is a big thing I wanted to share with you from this point here, is that sometimes we think, I remember one time when I first began, maybe 10 years ago, talking about this topic of mental health. Someone took me aside and said, Mina, thank God we're Coptic. We don't have to deal with this stuff. I was like, man, I want to be whatever world you're living in, I want to be a part of that world. But in this world where everybody else is, even if we're Coptic, even if we love God, even if God loves us, we still struggle and deal with some things. Quick true and false. Did you know this, or is this true? Is mental health more common than diabetes? True or false? True. Mental illness, right? True or false that depression is the #1 cause of disability worldwide? Look at the whole world. What's like the most disabling thing you can think of? Would you think depression?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. One time in a different church, I gave this statistic and so on. It will probably be something more physical, because that's really disabling. Why are you saying depression is disabling? It's like, well, then we're not really familiar with what it means to have major depression, which is fine. And lastly, most importantly, sometimes we talk about these ideas of mental health things in the church, and we think, wow, this sounds really tough. Sounds like a really difficult situation. Is there anything we can really do about this? The reality is, mental health concerns are really, really treatable. You know the time where it's tough to respond well to mental health disorders or to have a good result is when we don't do anything about them. But when somebody is really going through treatment in a full way, you can do really well. You can respond really, really well. Okay, that's one of the take-home messages I want to give to you today is if I'm seeing someone who's struggling through this, they're able to respond well, and their life can be significantly different if they're engaged in treatment, both from a spiritual end of things, as well as from a biological, psychological end of things. Make sense so far? Good? Okay. Here are some things we're going to talk about. We're not going to have time to talk about everything. We're going to try to end on time, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, and this stuff can kind of go a whole day. These are some of the big picture things. Okay? Anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, eating disorders, ADHD. I'm going to try to focus on, for the sake of Sunday school and kids, talk about some things that we see in children. And again, we're fortunate now, it's 2020, that we can probably not worry about diagnosing people. Things are going to get diagnosed in school or in other kind of avenues. But the big question is, so I have an hour with a kid on Sunday, and I'm looking at this behavior, and I'm not sure if this is behavior I should be punishing this behavior. Should I be adjusting this behavior? How should I approach this kid? Someone's struggling with something at home. What is my reaction to that struggle? Make sense? Here's sometimes the frustrating thing for us, especially as servants. People don't often come and tell you, hey, help my kid. He's 14. He's really struggling with whatever. They'll say what my kid is like rude or frustrating or other words that we shouldn't say, like in church, right? Like, oh, this kid's a problem kid. This kid's a problem kid. Raise your hand if you've been a problem kid. I was a problem kid. I know some of you have definitely been problem kids because I'm used to seeing you. Right? Some of them still problem. That's right. Right? So all these, like, when people don't have the right context of what the person is feeling, for us in the church, we just see people who are doing the things the right way, and all these problem people. All these problem people. And sometimes we get frustrated with the problem people, and they stop coming. Because we can't handle the problem people. You get what I'm saying? So part of our focus will be for people in the church, as well as for people who sometimes now have had a difficult time remaining in the church because of their experiences and what they're struggling with. Here's my big question for you. Okay? The big question we want to differentiate for a lot of these things, are these things spiritual problems or clinical disorders? So let me ask you the following. Okay, when I think about depression, when I tell you I'm a servant, I'm Mia, I'm a servant of the church, and I have depression, what is your response to me? What would you suggest? What's your advice to me today? Any thoughts?
Have you been diagnosed?
Have I been diagnosed? Say, that's actually a really good question to start with. I don't know who said it. There's like a sea of people, but yeah. But let's say, you know what? Oh, wow, that's a great question. So you mean there's a difference between diagnosed, there's a difference between something clinical and something where, I don't know, but aren't there people in the Bible who just felt really down all the time? Isn't the answer to my problems a spiritual answer? And here's the tension that we sometimes have in the church, right? Like I'm speaking at a retreat next week, and people gave me a heads up. They're like, listen, we don't want any of this clinical mumbo-jumbo. Give us just things from the Bible. We love the Bible. Things are from the Bible, that's where the answers are. But the Bible has also given us medicine. Let me go on to say this. Same with anxiety. Let me ask you the following. Have you or someone you know ever said maybe that they're struggling with like anxiety or worry? And the natural assumption is if you're really worried, it means what spiritually? It means you have no faith. Habibi, if you have faith, you wouldn't worry so much. If you're really, really sad all the time, for weeks on end, that's really because you have not properly understood the joy of the Lord. Is that the case? Sometimes. Maybe sometimes no, though. Right? And this is why I'm trying to relate to you the tension that we have here. Here's what we're not going to say, just so I spell it out in case it doesn't come across. We're not going to say that there is no spiritual role to every element of our lives. There 100% is. And sometimes the sort of secular world misses this. It misses it. It says that there is no role for God in your life. Of course there is. However, as a Christian, is there a role for science in your life too? 100%. Does that make sense? So we can hold both things in our hands as young people and people who are in this society of education as well as spirituality without losing either one. Does that make sense? So this is going to be some of the questions here. And I tell you this versus that because as somebody who's in the church, I've had a lot of people come and say, hey, I have this. Does this mean it's a spiritual problem? And maybe, and just a side note, side fact, even in the clinical book that diagnoses mental health problems, there's a section called spiritual problem. Did you know that? Technically, if you go to a good psychiatrist, they should be able to say, you know what, actually the fact that you're really concerned about this is strictly a spiritual problem. You should go to a Buddha. It's in the book, it's in the handbook, in the DSM. But people don't always know that. PTSD, we'll try to touch on that a little bit as well. Where do people go first for help? Quick question for you. If somebody's a young person, an adolescent, where is their first go-to for help? Is it church, school, work, parents? What do you think? You can say out loud.
A friend.
A friend. Thank you for the contribution. A friend is a good idea. Maybe Ghostbusters, maybe a family doc, maybe a mental health professional, maybe the church. The research kind of tells us that if you're someone who belongs to a church community, the church is oftentimes the number one place to go. And even the friend is sometimes a friend in church. Does that sound like it's consistent with your experience too? Right? If you had something that's going on with you, who are you going to confide in? You're going to confide in somebody right here, the servant next to you. Drop your pizza. I got to tell you what I'm going through. I'm going to run through this, but I want to bring this point home. I'm either going to skip this really quickly or we'll dwell on it for a few seconds depending on where we are as a church. There was a survey done by a place called Lifeway, and they asked this question. People with mental illness, let's say, they were talking about specifically severe mental illness, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, things like that. But even let's go more mild. Let's go to depression. Say somebody in the church with maybe depression, somebody in the church with generalized anxiety disorder. They asked this question, can they totally overcome it, totally get better with prayer and Bible reading alone? What do you guys think?
No.
Who's for, I agree? Okay, who's for, I disagree? Who's for, I'm curious to see what everybody else says. So I'm glad that you answered that way, because in this gigantic survey of thousands of people, it was not Catholic people, just as a disclaimer. If you see in the blue, 48% of people agreed. This was some time ago, it wasn't yesterday. But I'm glad we're not there. This is a big, beginning portion. Is the fact, and I'll put it in the slide, but I'll tell you this now if you want to remember something. Our approach from the Orthodox Church on how to treat mental health issues is we do the following. It's 4 things. It's biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. All 4 are important. We do not believe that if somebody has a mental health disorder, then they should only seek spiritual help out of the 4. We do not believe that. That is not what the Orthodox Church believes. Does that make sense? Just in case you were wondering, because I'm glad you also believe it, but I just want to clarify it for you. It's also what the church believes. The church believes it's fantastic. And I have a whole other slide set of lectures on what the church fathers say about despair and despondency and sadness. How do we address that from a patristic standpoint? But a social standpoint, a psychological standpoint, and even a biological standpoint. Here's when it gets tough. If a co-servant of yours came and said, you know what? I'm really struggling with this, man. And I have to start taking medication. Think about your own response for a second. Is our response like, dude, that bad? It's that bad? I know it's not a good time, but right? Let's pause for a second for our own, because I'm glad in the beginning we're like, yes, of course, yes, obviously. I mean, right? But it's different if it's home. It's different if it's one of our co-servants. If it's our family member. If it's a brother or a sister or a mom or a dad. God willing, next month I'm going to talk in a different talk somewhere else to just parents in Arabic. I'm going to flex my Arabic a little bit. Because what is the number one question we sometimes have about this is, whose fault is it? Whose fault is it? The parents would be like, are you saying I'm a bad parent? What are the kidding? I'm a bad parent? I'm the best parent. Whose fault is it? And what Jesus tells us, I actually want to show you just this. Yes, this little quote. You remember from the story in John 9 where there was a person born blind? And they asked him, who sinned? Because as Middle Eastern people, our number one goal in life is to blame people for stuff. Whose problem is this? You. Was it the parents? Society? Facebook? Right? Who do we blame for this? And Jesus said to them, neither. Neither them, neither this. This is not the issue. The issue is not to blame. Is this good so far? We're okay, we're clear. This is foundational stuff, but we're going to breeze through it. So we don't have to spend too much time on it, so I won't belabor this. This is a beautiful actually passage, if you're curious, from Sirach 38, where God talks about where healing comes from. Anything from a physician, anything from medicine, it comes, the true source of healing is always the Lord himself. We won't go too far with that. And this is the model that I told you, this is the Orthodox treatment model, as well as in the secular world too, if they're doing it correctly. The bio, psycho, social, spiritual model. Make sense? Okay. I'm going to skip this because the answer to it, let's say, is we said yes. Skip this and skip. This I wanted to just highlight for you. There's an organization called NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, which is based in Maryland. It's the national place where they give funding for research. It's the government, basically. And the numbers they put is how well people can respond when they're properly treated to mental health. Huge, huge successes. Even more so, people in the church. This is what we've noticed as well in St. Luke's, the Coptic Mental Health Center. Is in our community, because we do a really good job of like social support most of the time. We do a pretty good job of like family and friends and church and community and koinonia and all these things, right? Fellowship. But sometimes we just miss maybe the biological, and sometimes we just miss a little bit of the therapy kind of psychological piece. When you add those two to an already pretty good foundation, what studies show us, there's over 3,000 of them. And this, by the way, is this is what I'm talking about at work. Like at work, I'm telling them the value of spirituality, and in church, I'm trying to say the value of all the other stuff. Just as an example. What we see, though, in all these studies is that if you have a good foundation already of spiritual background, you actually respond better. But what happens is if you have, it's sort of like a three-legged or a four-legged chair, right? If you have already 3 legs, you just need one more leg, you're good. You can sit on it pretty well. But if you only try to sit on the one leg of spirituality, it's a little fuzzy. Make sense so far? Okay. This I wanted to share with you, actually. I want to send you a little PDF, something that was made specifically for servants from the American Psychiatric Association, of how, it's 20 pages, heads up about what medications are, what mental health disorders are, and it's actually made for faith leaders. We can either go through this in quick. Anybody curious about what medications are in mental health? Like, does this part need going through or skip it? Skip it. Okay. So you have it. This you can Google it, but this is a heads up about what meds are. Wanted to say, what has the church done? And it's a lot. The reason I show you this is to give you a sense of in the church clinic, the spectrum of things that have been treated in the church clinic. We won't go through them in detail, but basically covering them. And then the outcomes have been really good. Quick note I want to mention to you just about addiction. Because sometimes we're dealing with kids like high school kids or younger. Now, unfortunately, it gets younger and younger. Where, you know what? This kid is just smoking so much weed. This kid is just vaping all the time. What do we do about that? What do we do about that? One school of thought is like, okay, stop doing what you're doing, and then come and be part of the community. Because otherwise, if you be part of the community with what you're doing, you're going to make everybody else bad. The framework that I want to maybe suggest to you is this. Addiction, from what we believe, it's why there's even an addiction center in the Southern Diocese, falls in the same 4 realm categories as everything else. Meaning, there is medicine that can help. There is counseling that can help. There's therapy that can help. And there's an important spiritual role to addiction in the church. Sometimes, when we worry so much about the behavior, oh, this kid is doing behavior, whatever. We try to make them stop the behavior before we make them stop. Or we try to introduce God to them after they stop the behavior. Does that make sense? We put up another barrier for people who are using this behavior as a way to cope with what they're feeling. So just a quick note on addiction. Any questions so far? Okay. Have you heard in the past, or have you had a discussion before, about kids with special needs in the church? Has that been discussed for us as servants? No. Okay. Are you familiar with, so for this part I'm going to go through an overview of a couple of, maybe 10, 15 minutes? 10 minutes? Okay. A couple of mental health things and how we should approach them a little bit in the church, okay? Are you familiar with autism spectrum disorder? You familiar with this disorder? Okay. Do we have anybody in the church with autism? We do, okay. So our challenge is not going to be, oh, we've discovered now a new diagnosis, or like we've diagnosed a new kid with autism, right? That's not going to be our task in the church. But maybe our task is, how do we handle this in Sunday school? I'll give you an example. You're in class, whatever grade, and the child is disruptive. What do?
Our go-to action is kick him out.
Good, thank you, Maroni. That's an honest answer, right? Because I know I've experienced that as a kid, even without autism. Kid acting up.
I wasn't kicked out.
Max somehow was never kicked out, right? Still around somehow. I'm trying. Like, please leave, please. It's too strong. Wrestle the rest of us. Stay here. Right? But our go-to, you're right. Let's be honest. Let's be real, right? Because what we expect is like, behave. If you don't behave, shh, stop, yell, scream. Ultimately, get out of here. Bless you. But just a heads up, it's particularly not a good idea for kids that we are helping serve with autism. In one church, not too far in Jersey, they even have kind of a special once-a-month liturgy for the children with special needs. Specifically, a heads up for us in this category. It can be really helpful, especially if there's more than one servant. Instead of kicking the kid out, you go with the kid. Say, you know, we're going to take a little bit of a break. Maybe you and I, we go together for a minute, we take a time out. And we talk separate from the rest of the class. At times, it might be helpful. Do we have any classes right now for kids with autism?
Yes.
We do. That's excellent. That's amazing. So you guys are even ahead of where a lot of other places are. Partially, I know, because you have wonderful servant leadership. So in that class, going through some specifics on, which maybe you had this too. Have you had a little bit of training maybe about how to approach that class differently?
Servants that serve.
Servants have. Okay, good. So we won't belabor it too much. So the fact that this is already covered. So there's a different class with this is a great consideration. We can move on. Any questions on this? Because if it wasn't this far, then I would go with more detail. But if it's not, then it's sort of, you guys are in a good place with that. Yes?
Yeah, can you elaborate more like how you approach this, how you deal with it? Because not all of us have the knowledge or experience.
Sure. Here's the general idea of how you serve someone on the autism spectrum, okay? Firstly, understand that there is a need for detail, schedule. Let's say if you're actually in the class, it's very helpful. Like I was talking about this with my wife, Miriam, who's a therapist for children with autism, an ABA therapist. The more scheduled you are in advance, the better. The less stimulation, the better. The more, if you're speaking one-on-one, quieter, and understanding that they may not have eye contact with you, you may need to maintain your tone at a certain level. They may not listen to the first thing you say. Things are simplified to the best of your ability. Those are some of the key things, basically. In terms of learning, the more visual it can be, the better, especially for us here in Sunday school. That's a generally good idea, but even more so in children with autism. More visual, more color, more different ways to engage instead of just kind of saying, hey, Habibi, this is the story of Noah. Noah did this, which is our usual elaborate way of doing Sunday school. Does that make sense? So patience, systematically going through like a schedule, knowing what to expect, because routine is very valuable for children with autism. They really want to be able to have kind of a sense of, here's what's happening now, here's what's happening next, and less surprises, right? That sometimes can be an important part as well. These are some kind of small things, but they go a long way. And when we interact with the family, this is a really important thing in service as well. We want to reiterate to them that they have the support of the church, and that we're with them in every possible way, that there is no judgment or blame or, you know what I mean? Like, or looking at them in some less than way. That your child is loved and accepted and treated with the same dignity and respect as every other child. Because oftentimes this can be a difficult thing, obviously, for the family to do. Does this make sense? More specifics or more things on the approach? Yes?
This is if the parents already know that they get
Yes.
they have a problem. But what if the Sunday school teacher realizes some symptoms for depression or ADHD or especially in the young grade, what is the right way to approach the family which they don't have any clue about what their children might have?
Right. That's a great question. So, just in case anybody didn't hear it, let's say whether for this or something else, maybe ADHD, maybe depression, maybe something else, and we want to approach the family. Our first thing, again, they may not all feel this way, but oftentimes the first reaction is a defensive one from a family. To say that you're going to come at me and you're going to accuse me that there's something wrong with my kid. Okay? So you should know that going into the conversation. Because you know that going in, our first step is reassurance. And say, you guys, however you want to phrase it in the relationship with the family, I know that you're trying your best. I know that you're a wonderful mom. I know you're a wonderful dad. However it is, reassurance of this is not a judgment on your parenting or your character or your family or any of those things. Does that make sense? If you can lay that foundation, it makes the person less likely to just come at you and be defensive. Secondly, to say, understand your role. You're not necessarily, unless you are, maybe you are, and also a servant, you're not going to say, I think your kid has whatever. Okay? Because we don't know that. It's like for me, if I see somebody and I think they might have, diabetes, I don't make those diagnoses every day. Well, I wouldn't even say that. I would say, I think your kid's diabetic. I wouldn't say that. What we would say is, you know what? Little Bechomios is like, he's great in Sunday school, right? We love him so much. Again, starting with an affirmation of who the kid is and how you love him. But sometimes I feel like he's struggling a little bit with whatever. He's struggling a little bit to kind of focus in class. Do you think we can find a way to get him some more help? The question for us is, can we have someone else take another look and give us an assessment? The assessment is not coming from us. The opinion, the diagnosis, the treatment, none of those things. But you have a critical role to be able to say, once you've established the foundation, to be able to say, you know what? The child is struggling, and thank God we live in America, thank God we live in glorious Staten Island, right? That we have resources here. We don't live in the middle of a third world country, that there's nothing that we can do. So because we have resources, do you think we can connect to maybe a resource to have him or her, someone to talk to, maybe see if there's any additional help that we can give, and frame it in such a way that wow, there's an opportunity here that we can have more help, and it could be at no cost, things of that nature. Does that make sense? Those are it's critical in that approach, and sometimes you can do all that, and people can still be mad at you. I had a friend, we know what Danny. And so he was telling me even his own difficulties in the church, because he's someone who gets this. Sometimes you can have a conversation and say, Habibi, you should also, I'm going to continue to give you absolution, but you should also have, speak with a therapist. Sometimes it's very well received. Sometimes it's like, oh my God, how are you going to abandon me? What kind of a boon are you? Right? Sometimes it may not go well even with that approach that I'm telling you. And sometimes you may need to have some reinforcement then. Maybe the parent, depending on what their concern is. That's why if it's not going well, take your time, I'll just tell you this. If it's not going well, you want to dig into what the concern is for that parent. Maybe the concern for that parent, we don't really know. Maybe the concern would be, you know what? I'm worried it's going to be too expensive and I can't afford it. They may not be comfortable saying that to you, but you may have to kind of tease that out a little bit. Maybe the concern will be, you know what? I'm worried that people know in church, they're going to think my kid is whatever. So you affirm the fact that this is confidential, it's between me and you, no one else will know, that kind of stuff. But you don't know what to approach if you don't know what the actual concern is. Does that make sense? Okay? So foundation of that you're loved and nobody's fault. Second, I'm not making a diagnosis, I'm helping you here to see if there's any other support we can get. Thirdly, digging into what our individual concerns are in this particular situation and seeing how maybe we need to have maybe we need to hear it from a priest. Sometimes that works. Maybe you need to hear from another doctor in church. Maybe that helps. But it's a very good question. Yes?
Are these symptoms the same of the autism? Are
Yeah.
the same symptoms for the depression and sadness for kids? Like how I can figure out if this kid is just shy, he doesn't talk too much, or he is depressed or suffer from autism?
Good question. So the reason it can be a little bit hard, if you don't already know any kid's background, of like is the kid dealing with anxiety or autism or something else, this can be difficult to diagnose. So that's why I don't encourage you necessarily to know the full label of what this is. In terms of overlapping behavior, sometimes a child who is incredibly severely anxious can have some overlap in how he looks with children with autism. Or a child who's severely depressed can be very kind of withdrawn, not talk to anyone, have no eye contact, and it could be difficult for them, and they can look the same, as autism. For us, what's relevant is the conversation with the family if it's not something that's being treated. Say, hey, you know what, I feel like Johnny may not be, himself sometimes in church. Is he getting all the support that he needs? If that step is covered, then I focus on he may be getting support he needs at school, or she may be getting other therapy, all that kind of stuff. But they need more support in church now. They may need more support in Sunday school. And it may not be necessary for me to know if this is something that behavior is coming from this bucket or that behavior is coming from this bucket. It's more important for me to focus on how I can be supportive for him in that moment. Because it's going to be just too hard for you to say, okay, it's because of this, and that's how, unless you know the person individually and have a relationship with the family. You can get lost in it. Make sense so far? Okay. Just a little bit about treatment. I just wanted to mention ADHD for a second because it was literally in a different church that somebody said to me that I feel like maybe my kid is struggling really badly in school, and we all know how school is the most important thing in the universe, right? So, of course, how else are you going to be, what? Doctors and lawyers, right? So if that's the card that you want to play with the parents, say, hey, the child is really struggling in school. Sometimes they can look in one of two ways. This is the part that can be missed, and it's important for us to be another kind of pair of eyes and ears, especially in young girls for ADHD. Sometimes it's not just the person making the most noise and is the most hyper. Sometimes it's the most quiet person who's the most inattentive and has difficulty paying attention and following you in the lesson. So that could be another thing to kind of look out for and potentially to have the conversation with the family. It's a little bit about that. And as well as how you tailor your lesson plan there, because this child may not necessarily be in that class of children with autism, but you may also want to approach them differently in your generalized class. Make sense? It's a little bit about treatment, medications, but we're not. Point is medications that are effective. We don't have to know them specifically. I'm going to skip panic. Should we stop here? How much more minutes? 5? You guys just tell me, because I know it's a long day. Or how about this? I'm going to skip unless you tell me this is something that's a really common thing that we see, because I'll give you the slides. Baka has the slides and the little PDF with more reading. But you tell me if you have more questions about a particular disorder. Just give me a hand raise for the sake of time. Does that make sense? I don't want to go through everything in detail. Panic disorder is one thing. The one thing I want to tell you about panic disorder, people sometimes ask me in the office is like, no dude, you should not be dealing with this the rest of your life. You should be treated for this, and there's really effective treatment that you should not have panic attacks your whole life. Shouldn't happen. Here's some symptoms. We know from like culture and stuff what a panic attack looks like.
What is fear of dying?
What's that?
Fear of dying.
Fear of dying is like you feel like you're gonna die right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, not like in general. In general, it's okay to have fear of dying. Unless you're Christian, you know the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, that's what that means. And this is it's a terrifying feeling to feel like right now you're a young, healthy person and you're going to die. Habibi, you're fine. No. I'm gonna die right now. It's terrifying. Terrifying. And the people that I see oftentimes will wind up in the ER multiple times. This happens oftentimes in church
Dying?
as well. The fear of dying for multiple reasons.
In church?
Yeah, let me give you an example. There were some people that their anxiety level kind of triggers in church, being around a whole lot of people. I know, of course, the church is organized as us, like we would never have that problem. But say you're on a communion line and like one dude that's trying to choke you and the other person's like climbing on your neck. It's very common to have extreme anxiety at that point and say, you know what, I don't know if I can do church anymore, man. Honestly, I can't do church. It happens. And then people get treated and they can do church again. Make sense? So that's from a panic standpoint. Panic is basically the most severe manifestation of anxiety. Somebody can be in church and unable to come back because of panic. Or somebody could be, I'll leave it at that. And there's really good treatment. Phobias are another thing that we know from culture. Sometimes it can happen, it can affect people spiritually too in church for the same reason. And I was speaking with a patient last week who had a really bad phobia of flying. And he thought this was just the way it is. People have phobias of flying and they can't fly, and that's the way it is. Not the way it is. Okay. There's treatment for it.
So he's never traveled because of...
Couldn't travel. Somebody was like, oh, I wish I could take a trip. So take a trip. He's like, no, when I get on an airplane, I feel like I'm going to die. Right? So can't do it. I had someone, Coptic, different city. The anxiety would get so severe that he would vomit before going to church. You can't do it. If you're vomiting several times a day.
Because he's going on a pack.
Because like a bunch of people around, a bunch of Egyptians, were all just like various aromas, just like, various deodorants that are not existent. Like just, no, but I mean, we make some, anyway, the point is, statistically speaking, guys, just a heads up, and I re-looked this up last night because I wasn't sure what the latest numbers are. Around 20% of people around you would be really struggling with a significant anxiety disorder. 20% is a huge number. 19.5%. Or 8% dealing with major depressive disorder in the church. Out of 100 people in the church, we're a church of 5,000, families or people or something? How many hundreds of people is that in the church? And how many of us are treated and how many of us aren't treated? How many of us are totally ignored? Right? That's why I'm saying it's not as it could seem weird to us. I feel like, oh man, I can't imagine what this is like. But this is happening right under our noses. Yes?
So what are some next steps you could take as a church community to address it throughout the population, not just with kids?
I love
Maybe
it.
there's sometimes parents going through it.
Yes, great question. What do we do? What are the next steps that we address? One part is actually what we're doing now. To be able to say, as a servant community, we're talking about this. It's a thing. It's here. It's not somewhere far away. No, it's here. One part will also be I was looking at one draft of another kind of curriculum for Sunday school for kids that addresses this. Like, how do we talk about anxiety in the curriculum? High school, junior high school, elementary school, and not just anxiety in general. Bullying, trauma, things that are big words, but the kids deal with all the time. Kids everywhere know that there is an idea going around of bullying and how that's traumatic. Kids everywhere know that yes, there was 13 reasons why. A Netflix thing about suicide. The idea of depression, the idea of suicide are things that they see. So one part, practically, is how do we build it into the curriculum? The average church nationwide has one or less conversations about mental health a year. 1 or 0 in the evangelical world. In the Coptic world, I think it's 0 or -10. But now you guys are already ahead of the curve again. So one part is in the curriculum with the kids. 2, in our conversations. What conversations are we having, honestly? Oh, so-and-so, oh man. That's kind of weird, man. Why would you feel that way? That's so weird. I mean, our own language, our own conversation. Because a lot of us in the room are struggling in the same thing, but we may not be able to even talk about it if we all pretend like, you know, that doesn't work. Another thing could be having a chat with the parents too. Having a talk maybe with the parents to be able to say, this is something that we're talking about because our kids are struggling with it, and we want to deal with it in the best possible way. So dealing with it on a step in each layer. I know there's been conversations in like the high school meeting, in the college meeting, as servants, more and more discussion. Yes?
Can we do the same speech for the parents? Because,
Yeah.
well, it's good to educate the parents about these topics. And the main gathering is the liturgy. So if we can dedicate the speech during the liturgy for some of the topics to the parents, it would be good.
Sure. Yeah. I'd be happy to do it. Works out. Cool. So maybe stop there, right? Unless there are more questions. The rest of these slides, if you want to go through them, it's just basically, I go through some other things of like, what does it mean to have depression, for example? Maybe I'll just say that and I'll end with this. The big picture that I want to give you, because sometimes the big question that we have is this just a spiritual problem or is it a clinical problem? I want you to think about 4 things, right? First, how long does this last? It's something we all have a bad day, right? If you're a Friends fan, at some point, like it hasn't been your day, week, or month, or if it hasn't been your year, then it's a bad year. Hasn't been your year, that's something that tells you right there. How long something lasts, how frequently it goes on. If you're having an intense kind of feeling, but it's happening frequently, every single day, it's different. How intense it is. We said anxiety, I get kind of worried. Oh, did I hear a siren go by? Am I getting pulled over? You know, the police? So I get an intense feeling, but if it's so intense that it's from 0 to 10, it's like a 10, then it tells you something else. And lastly, most importantly, is duty or function. For our kids, it's a simple question. Something is getting in the way of what's going on at school, getting in the way of what's going on socially in their life. It should make us at least pay attention. Just like, oh, wait a minute. You're not able to do the things you used to. You're not able to really study. You can't really function at school. You can't really function with your friends. You can't really function with, at home. So function at least gives us a wait a minute, pause. Does that make sense? Yes?
I think the only issue with depression, other than anxiety and all that, anxious kids sometimes going to tell you why I'm anxiety with this. The problem with depression, these are the kids that you're never going to hear anything from them a lot of the times,
Yes.
unless they're really close to you. They're as you said, they're a lot of the times just the quiet ones.
Right.
And it's very hard to diagnose or very hard to even pay attention when the kid is originally quiet.
Right.
And they're going through depression, so it's even harder to realize, unless you have a personal relationship, where a personal relationship comes in with the servants.
Absolutely. And I think you nailed it. That's key right there, because none of these things are things that you could sort of look from. That's why we even have a rule in psychiatry that you can't make diagnoses from a distance, just through the window. It takes a personal relationship. And maybe that's the tie-in also for us as servants here. Is that why are we talking about this? Who cares about this stuff? We talk about this stuff because we love our kids. We love our kids. We want to have a personal relationship with them. We want them to know they can confide in us. And because we love them so much, we want to pay attention to nuance. The small things. This kid, I know him. The Lord Jesus says, right? The sheep know his voice, and they are known by him, and he's able to kind of tell you who you are by name, and the hairs of your head, all that kind of stuff. What it means to be a good shepherd in church, as a servant, is to know, okay, this kid's usually pretty quiet. This is more quiet than usually is. And depression in kids can sometimes not look just as quietness, but as irritability. This kid seems like every time a small thing happens, it really sets him off. He gets more and more upset, and things really go off the deep end. So I think that's a great actually tie-in at the end, is that we can't use any of this information unless we have a relationship with the children, a relationship with the family. But once we have that relationship, there's good information that we can use to really help them along, in the best possible way. All right, any other questions? If there's any other like burning questions, feel free to talk to me afterwards. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Glory be to God forever. And thank you guys.
Thank you.
I really want to thank